So it's really an honor and a pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague, John Harte, for our symposium speaker today. John's a distinguished professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He helped found, was a founding member of the Energy and Resources Group, which is an interdisciplinary program at Berkeley. One of the other, I guess, founding members was John Holdren, who's a good friend of John's and colleague, who's now our national science advisor. Now, John came to ecology and evolution, well, ecology and evolutionary biology circuitously through physics. He was trained as a physicist at Harvard and University of Wisconsin, and then went on and was an assistant professor at Yale as a physicist, and then sort of realized the more interesting questions had to do with the environment and ecology, and took his quantitative skills and sort of brought them over. Another thing that really is exciting about John is he sort of illustrates the best of sort of the scholar-citizen interface, in that he asks questions about really compelling things, acidification and the consequences of that, or climate change, and then doesn't shy away from connecting with the public and helping to influence policy. And this sort of interface between primary science, making theory, testing theory, and bringing the message to the public, and in some cases activism, is something that is unique, and not everyone can do it, and John, I think, does it really well. And one of the reasons we invited him here today was to share his experiences, insights, and knowledge about climate change. And what he's going to do today is talk about predicting climate change on the green planet, the daunting challenge. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thanks very much. You know, to be honest, when I was looking at the posters down the hall, I thought they were by graduate students and postdocs. They're really remarkable, and found them very exciting, and you guys should be proud. I'm not going to talk about climate policy today, although it's tempting given the current atmosphere in which the whole policy debate is so curdled by a combination of misunderstanding of science and distortions about the political and economic dimensions of climate change. I'm going to focus on the science, but in the question period, if you do want to raise issues about policy, I'd be happy to entertain them. I'm going to try to do several things today, and in some ways they're mutually contradictory. On the one hand, in the first part of the talk, I'm going to try to convince you that we know an enormous amount about global climate change and the human influence on it, enough to convince ourselves that this is easily a problem worthy of rapid policy responses. But then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to almost contradict that first part and tell you about the things we don't know, and indicate to you that there are huge areas of climate change that we are in the dark about, and we need to know. And then in the third part, I'm going to show you some ways in which we've gone about trying to understand these presently ambiguous and uncertain dimensions of climate change, and try to convince you that the challenge is huge, that there are major uncertainties in our ability to pin down the answers to these daunting challenges. And just to give away the focus of what the daunting challenges are, and you can probably tell from the title, it has to do with how ecosystems couple to climate. Because ecosystems are affected by climate, but they also hugely influence climate. And that two-way feedback interaction is enormously interesting, it's enormously complicated, and we have a lot to learn, and there are some very fundamental impediments to trying to push the knowledge further in that direction. So let me begin with part one, global warming, the basics. The history of the Earth's atmosphere over the last 150 years is one in which certain gaseous constituents, in this case carbon dioxide, have been increasing rather rapidly. The first part of this curve is Ice Age data and rather crude data from various stations not systematically carried out. From here on, the data become very systematic and carefully done, thanks to the work of Charles Keeling and the establishment at Mauna Loa of a really good carbon dioxide monitoring system. On this side, we see the increase in the contributors to this increase in carbon dioxide, namely, at least most of the contributors, not all. What we're looking at here are the contributors to the world's energy supply from 1850 to 2000, natural gas, petroleum, coal, and down here, nuclear, hydro, and biomass. And the primary source of the buildup of carbon dioxide is the increasing amount of coal, oil, and gas that are being burned to supply the world with its energy. In addition, not shown here is deforestation, which is also a major contributor to the buildup of carbon dioxide. The basic idea is that as we build up levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as well, very importantly, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and chlorofluorocarbons, we trap heat that would otherwise be radiated out to space. These gases have the capacity to trap the heat and re-radiate it back down to the Earth's surface. In that sense, we get doubly warmed by the sunlight that generates heat when it's absorbed at the surface, and then again by the heat re-radiated back down as it tries to escape through the greenhouse layer. And this can happen over and over again with a multiple scattering type of pattern. The central prediction of current climate models, the general circulation models, goes as follows. That you ask the model the following question: what will happen to Earth's average surface temperature in response to a doubling of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent of a doubling of carbon dioxide because of the contributions of the methane and the other greenhouse gases? And it's typically expected that around the year 2050, we will see that doubling. And here's what the model project. They say that this direct effect of the heat trapping is going to be about 1.2 degrees Celsius with very little uncertainty. A reasonable error bar in that number would be roughly plus or minus 1/10 of a degree Celsius. This is just radiation physics, and it's pretty well understood. The complication and the uncertainty comes about when we look at what is potentially a much bigger contributor to global warming, and it's the feedback effects or indirect effects due to processes like the following. This much warming will melt ice and snow. When you melt ice and snow and expose bare ground, you've darkened the surface of the Earth, and that means the Earth absorbs more sunlight. We've lowered the Earth's albedo, to use the technical term. Albedo is a measure of the reflection coefficient of the Earth. By lowering it, we absorb more sunlight, we gain heat. We warm further. In addition, warmer air can hold more water vapor than colder air, and water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. We don't directly influence water vapor by emitting more to the atmosphere, but we do influence it by warming the air, and that's a feedback. Notice that both of these are positive feedbacks, not positive because they're good for you, but positive because they amplify the effect of the warming. Warming begets more warming. The third feedback is changes in the characteristics of clouds. And this is the one that's most uncertain. Much of this uncertainty arises because the uncertainty in cloud prediction. Cloud physics is in a pretty primitive stage, despite a century of effort to understand it better. And when you sum up these three feedbacks, you get a total feedback contribution of somewhere between plus 0.3 and plus 3.4 degrees Celsius on top of this. So you add up, you get about 1.5 to 4.6 degrees Celsius of warming from doubling CO2, and we can expect that around 2050. Now, before going on, I want to say that these are the three dominant feedbacks in the current models. These models were made by people like who I used to be, physicists. Physicists study physics, and they're not very good, as long as they're confining their scope to physics, to thinking much about ecology. And so to them, the planet is not green and pulsing with life and affected by the water and the radiation balance that's altered by life on Earth. Instead, they look at physical phenomena, and all of these are the physical phenomena that go into the current feedback predictions in the models. You might wonder, why should we worry about a 4-degree Celsius change in temperature? You walk out your door tomorrow morning, it's 4 degrees hotter than it was this morning, you might not notice. But interestingly, if we look back at the record of Earth's average temperature over the last 160,000 years, here's the present, not quite the present, this ends at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, actually, and go back 160,000 years, and we go back into an ice age, and now we have back here, 140,000 years ago, an interglacial period. This is the previous interglacial, this is the current interglacial where we sit today. And notice, during this ice age, there was a kilometer-thick sheet of ice covering Canada, much of what's now the United States, much of Europe, Siberia. It was cold. It was really a different planet. And yet, the difference between the global average temperature now, or at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in the depths of the last ice age was 6 degrees Fahrenheit. So 4 degrees is a big deal. Now, what I want to show you next is that the predictions that tell us what I showed you 2 slides ago should be taken seriously, and there are a couple of arguments. One is we can run those models from the mid-19th century to the present, and the observations are these solid lines, the dark central line. The model predictions are this blur of gray that sort of surrounds the data. The blur is because there are about 20 different models that get averaged together in making model predictions today. Different groups of climatologists run different models. They don't all agree, but what you'll notice is that the general pattern in the data is matched by the model. Not the details, but the general pattern. Now, some of the variability in here, much of the small-scale variability has nothing to do with greenhouse gases. It's got to do with sunspots and volcanic eruptions and other phenomena, natural phenomena that alter climate. But the trend in the data can only be explained by including the anthropogenic greenhouse effect into the model. Some people argue that solar variability is the explanation for this trend. Here's solar output from 1980 to 2008, and you'll see it goes through a nice regular cycle, no trend, over a period in which climate itself, temperature, had gone up. Now, there's another reason why the solar explanation is wrong, and I'll come to that in this next slide. We like to talk about the concept of a fingerprint of global warming. Just as in forensics, a fingerprint, or today a DNA sample, provides an enormous amount of information, way beyond what's present in just the average temperature. Average temperature is a crude and inadequate measure of climate. There are many, many aspects of climate that aren't captured by average temperature. For example, the general circulation models predict that as the surface is warming, as you saw in the previous slide projection of what that should look like, the stratosphere should actually cool. The models predict that the temperature rise should be faster in the nighttime than the daytime, faster in winter than summer, and high latitudes should warm more than low latitudes. These are common predictions from all the models. Interestingly, the data show the same thing. Well, each of these detailed fingerprints in the model output is matched in the record. If global warming were caused by a steadily brightening sun, as the skeptics of global warming or the deniers of global warming science like to impute, then the stratosphere would warm as the surface warms, and the temperature rise would be greater in the daytime than the nighttime. It's not what we see. What we see is the pattern predicted if greenhouse gases, the anthropogenic greenhouse gas buildup is the cause. Here's the crux of the argument, and if you have a climate denier and you want to talk to that person, here's what I would recommend you say. Look, essentially all of the observed climate change phenomena that we see today are consistent with the predictions of the general circulation models, assuming greenhouse gas-induced warming is present, assuming our current understanding of the effect of greenhouse gases on heat trapping and the feedbacks, assuming those are important, then the models are predicting a pattern that's consistent with the data. No alternative culprit has been identified so far that explains the trend of warming in the last 50 years. There is no explanation that's even been attempted at being published by deniers to explain it through any other mechanism. A credible skeptic or a credible denier would need to explain both what the alternative cause of the observed changes is if greenhouse gases are not the culprit, and how it could be that greenhouse gases are not having the effect that all of our current scientific understanding says that they do have. And again, no skeptic has even tried in a coherent fashion to do either of those two things. Instead, what happens is they spread myths about the science and give us basically a lot of noise about the fact that the sun causes the warming. You explain why it doesn't, and then they explain why there really isn't any warming, and then you explain why the data are unassailable on that point, and they go on to some other thing, and then eventually they come back around and say, oh, but it's the sun. So you chase them in a circle, and we get nowhere, basically, trying to talk to the hardcore committed deniers because they're not interested, in my opinion, in actual scientific engagement and evidence. Let's talk about what this is going to look like. What's the world that your children will know if we don't take action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions? Models project that we will see heat waves with temperatures of 130 degrees Fahrenheit or more for days at a time in the southern tier cities of the United States. The models project sea level rise of 1 meter or more due to what I call bipolar disorder, which is melting of ice at both in the Antarctic and the northern polar regions, with rise in sea level of 1 meter causing refugee problems on a scale that the planet has never witnessed. Up to 30 million or more Bangladeshi displaced by rising seas, entire nations wiped out in the South Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, coastal regions of Europe and North America inundated with higher seas, a huge cost to the built-in infrastructure along the coastlines, the piers and docks and warehouses and roads that are built to maintain commerce at the continent's edges. Projected worldwide extinction episode, possibly comparable to that at the end of the age of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. One example, particularly of concern to many of us, is loss of most of the world's coral reef ecosystems. Coral reefs bathed in waters above about 80 degrees Fahrenheit bleach out and the reef dies. And many coral reefs today are bathed in waters just a bit below that 80-degree Fahrenheit critical threshold. And when we're certain, if we don't take action to deal with global warming, to exceed it. And really threaten the world's ecosystems. Ocean acidification, also a big threat. Loss of most ice and winter snowpack in the Sierra, the Rockies, the Alps, the Andes, the Himalaya, with consequent disruption of irrigation water supplies for crops around the world. Already signs of this happening in Ecuador, where glaciers have disappeared and farmers have lost their dry season water supplies. And then large increase in the intensity of both storms and droughts. Arctic sea ice, I said, is melting. Here's a graph that shows the pattern of melt from 1978 to 2008. This is average monthly Arctic sea ice extent in September, a month when it's convenient to measure it and where the biggest changes are seen. And the data clearly indicate a trend, and this is not a trend that appears present in any previous period of recorded history. The fires, wildfires are increasing worldwide. These are incidents of fires and units of million acres burned per year from the 60s to the present. And again, one can see a trend that isn't explainable by anything other than the warming trend that you saw in the earlier slide. This, of course, represents another feedback, and it's one of the cases where an ecosystem feedback matters, because these forests that are burning contain huge amounts of carbon dioxide. As they burn, they add an additional carbon dioxide source to the atmosphere. Now we'll get to part two. And basically what part two is going to try to convince you of is that the situation is even worse than the physics models project because of climate ecosystem feedbacks, many of which, like the wildfires, are positive feedback, meaning they amplify the warming. Why don't we go through a paleo example? If you take our current models and ask them to predict the rate at which the North American ice sheet retreated starting around 16,000 years ago and continuing for the next 6,000 or 8,000 years, the ice sheet retreated. And if you look at the rate of retreat of the southern front of the ice sheet through Canada, and you use a conventional climate model to predict that rate, what you find is that the predicted rate is well below the actual rate. I'm not putting numbers on this because it will just obscure the point. The point is that the predictions are too low. We don't explain why ice retreats as fast as it does. And in those models, in the wake of the retreating ice, basically it's assumed that there will be rock and silt on the ground from the rubble underneath an ice sheet. And that has an albedo of about 0.4, meaning that it reflects about 40% of the sunlight hitting it. So this is a failure of the models. Now let's take those same models and put spruce trees into the model. Spruce trees grew in the wake of the retreating ice. And we know that from the pollen record that teaches us that it wasn't very long. It's a matter of a few centuries after ice departs northward from a spot in Canada that black spruce or other species of conifer come back. And as they come back, they darken the surface. And over the 6,000 years of ice retreat, with just a century or two lag between the spruce and the ice, the spruce being dark and having a lower albedo, an albedo of 0.1, so surface absorption is greater, we predict with the model a much faster rate of retreat. So the spruce are not following the ice, they're chasing the ice north with their darkness. And this is something you wouldn't get without putting the biology into the model. So I realized this actually about 30 years ago when I was looking at the models and trying to understand what global warming would look like. I was completely convinced that global warming was a serious issue, but I was worried about the lack of a role in the models for ecosystems. The Vostok data, very majorly important source of information about the Ice Age the era of ice ages and interglacial periods over the last million years, the Vostok data also imply a source of feedback that's not in our current models. Here are the Vostok data. Here's the present, 160,000 years ago. Here's that temperature record, slightly different from the one I showed you before because it's processed differently, but it's basically the same idea. Interglacial depths of ice age. Here's the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere over that same period of time. The carbon dioxide level is measured by extracting bubbles of trapped air gas in the ice core, dating the depth at which they're at, and actually measuring the concentration of CO2 in these little ice bubbles. And the CO2 and the temperature are obviously in lockstep. It's hard to resolve the phase difference or the time difference between, say, that peak and that peak, but the basic synchrony is there. There may be 100, 200-year difference in timing, but the question people ask themselves when they see this is, or the thing they first say is, oh yeah, this proves global warming. The carbon dioxide is up and so the temperature goes up. Now there's a little bit of a problem with that, and although it's essentially true. But what the problem is it doesn't answer the question, where did the CO2 come from? People were burning a lot of fossil fuel here, and very little here and a lot here. In fact, people weren't burning any fossil fuel during that period. It was not an anthropogenic effect. The only way to understand this pattern of data is to say that this is causing that and this is causing that. It has to be a two-way interaction. If you didn't include the effect of the carbon dioxide on the temperature increase, you couldn't explain the magnitude of those temperature excursions. The timing of the excursions is explained by subtle changes in the orbit of Earth around the sun, the so-called Milankovitch mechanisms. They are the timer. They tell the Earth when to start getting hot and when to start getting cold as the Earth's orbit subtly changes. The ellipticity of Earth's orbit around the sun and the tilt and angle of precession of Earth's spin axis around the plane of rotation of Earth around the sun. But the magnitude of the warming can't nearly be explained by these Milankovitch orbital effects. They explain a few tenths of a degree of warming or cooling. To explain all of this warming, you need all of that CO2 and some methane in addition, which I'm not showing you, but methane follows a pattern just like the carbon dioxide. So the greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, explain the magnitude of these temperature excursions, but only the temperature excursions can explain the magnitude of the CO2. So there's a feedback. A little bit of warming from Milankovitch, and we release CO2. That causes more warming. That releases more CO2. And we go up and up and up to the interglacial, and then Milankovitch says, oops, time to change, start cooling, and then the same feedback takes us down the cooling slope, same way as it takes us up the slope as we warm. So feedback is implicit in this, and it's carbon dioxide feedback, and the only two sources we can think of are either terrestrial forests and soils are releasing more carbon during warm periods, or the ocean, the exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ocean is responding to climate and causing this, or more likely a combination of both. Now, what's interesting is whatever it is that's causing this, it's not in the conventional climate model predictions. They don't include carbon cycle feedback. So why do we care about these missing climate feedbacks? They're terribly important because of the asymmetry in the uncertainty they induce. Even if we had as many positive feedbacks as negative feedbacks, but we don't, we have more positive. But let's suppose that we had equal numbers of positive and negative feedbacks. Here we are without these feedbacks, only with the current general circulation model, and we project about 4 degrees of warming. This includes the ice albedo, the water vapor, and the cloud effect. And this is the formula for the global average warming. It's 1.2 degrees, that's the direct effect, divided by something called 1 minus F, which is F is a feedback effect. And F in the current models is about 0.7. Now, suppose I add a new feedback effect to F. So F isn't 0.7, but 0.8. I go in this direction. If I have a negative feedback, I'll go in that direction. Let's say I take a couple positive feedbacks and I add a few tenths to the F of 0.7. This function 1 over 1 minus F rises to infinity as F approaches 1 or as this number approaches 0.3, because this is the 0.7 point. As we get to this point of F approaching 1, we have an instability in the system, like what probably happened on Venus, which had a runaway greenhouse effect, now has 100 times more CO2 in its atmosphere than we do, and has a surface temperature of 1,000 degrees Celsius. We're not there yet, but this is the way you would get there. If you wanted to, you would push the positive feedbacks up to that F equals 1 value, 0.7 plus 0.3, and we would end up with a runaway instability. Negative feedbacks take us in this direction, but notice that this function 1 over 1 minus F is intrinsically steep on that side, on the positive feedback side, and shallow on the negative feedback side. So if we're uncertain about the overall sign of the feedback, and we're told F is 0.7 plus or minus 0.25, that means the overall effect on temperature could be anywhere from about 2 degrees to, turns out, about 30 degrees. So there's a huge uncertainty and asymmetry in the uncertainty. That's why we care about these. There are an enormous number of biophysical responses that can trigger feedbacks. I've just listed a few here. More wildfire, releasing CO2 to the atmosphere, melting of permafrost in the Arctic, warming of soils globally, releasing from organically rich soils carbon dioxide and methane, warming of deep ocean and altered ocean circulation with the potential for release of deep pressurized methane clathrates in the seafloor to the atmosphere, altered vegetation communities which can affect the reflection coefficient, the albedo of Earth's surface, with the potential to either increase or decrease F, depending on whether we get shinier vegetation, which would be a negative feedback, or darker vegetation, which would be a positive. And then warming of ocean water, which can release less CO2, because just like a glass of beer, warmer ocean water really doesn't hold as much CO2 as cold ocean water. The potential is huge for the biologically mediated feedbacks to play a big role. If total ecosystem respiration, the summed quantity of soil decomposition respiration and plant respiration over the course of within a decade or two were to increase by just 5%, that would result in 5% of 125 gigatons of carbon per year released to the atmosphere. 125 gigatons is sort of gross primary productivity or total respiration on Earth. So a 5% increase in respiration caused by warmer temperatures would release 6.25 gigatons of carbon. That's twice the current rate of buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, let's look at some data. These are from soils in Colorado, but they show they're pretty typical of soil response to warming worldwide. Respiration rate, temperature. If you increase temperature, you find that a 50% rise in soil respiration results from a 5-degree rise in soil temperature. So here, just a 5% rise in respiration caused an amount of carbon released twice the current rate of increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is saying a 5-degree warming will cause a 50% rise in respiration rate. So the potential is huge to release the vast amounts of carbon stored in soil under higher temperatures. Soils today hold roughly 4 times as much carbon in the form of organic matter as the atmosphere holds in the form of CO2. So release just a fifth of soil carbon or a fourth, and you've doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Here are some albedo data for all the major biomes of the Earth arrayed from the equator to the pole. Rainforest, savanna, desert, shrubland, grassland, deciduous forest, all the way up to taiga and tundra. And what you can see is that the albedo differences between adjacent biome types are on the order of a few tenths. This is 0.35, this is 0.1. So there's a 0.25 difference in albedo. Now, the equivalent albedo change globally that is equivalent in heating effect of doubling CO2 is just a few percent. So these big differences in the albedo of adjacent biomes, adjacent latitudinally, are enough to be way more than have the climate effect of doubling the greenhouse gases. So these albedos are shifting to adjacent ones, and they won't all do that, but were they to, if for example, rainforest were to look more like savanna, or desert were to look more like shrubland, or taiga were to look more like boreal forest, or whatever the change, there's a potential for forcing of climate on a scale much bigger than the anthropogenic greenhouse gas effects. I won't run through the numbers with you, but it's we can go into more detail in the question period. Okay, the last part of the talk is how can we learn more about these feedbacks so that we don't just have to sit and look and say, gee, it could be huge. How can we actually try to come up with some predictions? How can we make a real science of climate ecosystem interaction? And there's several different things you can do. One is we can look at patterns across space and time. One way is to look along gradients, latitudinal or elevational. As we go up a mountain, we're looking at colder and colder temperatures, and maybe we can learn by studying soil carbon along a mountain slope what will happen to soil carbon when soils warm. We can also look at interannual variability of climate and decadal to century trends in climate, and again, look at ecological parameters, see how they correlate with historic climate changes. We can even do this over paleoclimate periods. Now, this is great. It gives us insights at large spatial scales, but all we'll get is correlations out of this, and correlations are not causation. To get at causation, we'd like to add to this approach the use of climate manipulation experiments, which will allow us to, under controlled conditions, look at effects and isolate actual mechanisms. The problem with experiments is they're always done at small scale for obvious practical reasons. Nobody has ever, with a control, warmed a large area. We're warming the Earth, that's an experiment, but no control. So each of these has its limits and its advantages. And then finally, we can use mathematical models, but of course the models are only as good as the data and processes that drive them, and you may not be able to see it so well, but down here in the lower left are model projections carried out 2 years ago by some people. They actually did a meta-analysis of taking 10 or 15 different model assumptions, all within the bounds of plausibility for how the carbon cycle will respond to warming. And they got huge effects, but they also varied all over the map, from positive feedback, huge positive feedback here, to even a negative carbon cycle feedback here. So there's a great uncertainty in the projections of models as to what will happen to the carbon cycle in a warmer climate. Now, to get at manipulation, to do a manipulation experiment, I want to show you what we've been doing in the Rockies. I started thinking about this in the 1980s, realizing that we weren't getting any real process-based insights into ecosystem response. So I thought to myself, a good way to do this would be to artificially warm an ecosystem. So we set up in the Colorado Rockies an area, you can see the site here in winter with the heaters melting out the plots early. This was taken in late April 1994, and it shows the effect of the heaters. There's banks of heaters. We have heated plots, control plots alternating, 10 plots total. Each is 10 meters by 3 meters, and the heated plots have 3 heaters over them, and the plots run along an ecotone from a dry upper zone down 33 feet or 10 meters to a wet lower zone. And this experiment is carried out at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, shown here in Gothic, Colorado. The experiment is done at 9,600 feet elevation. We turned on the heaters at the end of 1990. They've been on year-round, summer and winter, day and night, as we speak, ever since, warming the soil, drying the soil, and causing snow melt to occur earlier in the heated plots and snow to form on the ground later in the fall. So we've prolonged the growing season. And we've seen enormous numbers of responses. My students and I have published a total of 32 journal papers that came out just from this one experiment over the years, and it's produced a wealth of data on how a subalpine meadow responds to warming. One of the more dramatic effects is a complete shift in the dominant plant type in the heated plots. There are 3 types of plants in these plots: the graminoids, or grasses, the forbs, like the daisies shown here, the flowering non-woody plants, and then the woody shrubs, like Artemisia, a sagebrush. And what's happened in the heated plots is that where forbs were dominant in the beginning of the experiment, and here you see the forb cover and the control, and in the heated plots, 5 years into the experiment, the forbs were second dominant, and shrubs, sagebrush in particular, was dominant. And I don't have this was a paper we published in Science in '95. If we look further out, we see an even greater tendency for the shrubs to dominate the heated plots. The flowering success of the plants in the heated plots is down by up to a factor of 10 compared to flowering success in control plots. The forbs, especially the shallow-rooted ones, are still hanging in. Nobody's gone extinct, but their reproductive potential is down by a huge factor. Some plants, some years don't reproduce at all. These are all long-lived perennials, which is why we haven't lost anyone yet. But the projection is that we're going to start losing species over the coming decade from our knowledge of the lifetimes of these plants, and the shrubs will continue to dominate those plots. The second response was a huge carbon response. Here's carbon in the control plots, in the soils of the control plots. I'll explain this little dip in a minute. Here's the heated plots. Came down by the 4th or 5th year, reached a lower plateau. There's a difference in carbon in these soils between the control and the heated, where if it were to occur worldwide, would double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So far today, with all the fossil fuel burning, we've increased it by 30%. We'll double it around the year 2050, but here's another doubling right here. If, big if, what we see in these meadows is going to occur not just in those meadows, but worldwide. Interestingly, what we saw here was an exceptionally dry set of 5 years. And during those dry years, the control plots began to look like the heated plots looked during the wetter early period of the experiment. So, in a sense, science is imitating nature here with the experiment response in the control plots capturing during a natural drought what the heating or manipulation did during ordinary normal year. Now, some of this you could attribute to a global warming trend, you might think, but actually you can't. It would be far-fetched to say this is global warming. This was a 5-year drought, and now we're actually back up around here we've got year 20 data, I just haven't put it on the plot. We'll be starting the 21st year this summer, and this is going to be a you know, in the long run, the control plots will look like the heated plots as warming proceeds. But for now, what we're getting from this experiment is a preview of what future soil carbon will look like. There are also huge albedo differences. As the forbs are replaced by shrubs in the heated plots, we have an albedo decrease from about 8% albedo of the forbs and about 4.5% albedo for sagebrush. And that difference, again, is comparable to roughly doubling the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. So local plant shifts have the potential to create huge shifts in albedo. Now, this is all short-term stuff. 20 years is not a long time, and it's one little plot, or one set of 10 plots. How do we extrapolate to larger space and time scales? And one way would be to use what's called the space for time substitution, or space for treatment. The idea is that if we can understand how to relate the response to manipulations to responses along gradients, then we can use the mechanisms identified from the warming experiments under controlled conditions and the patterns seen along gradients to put it all together in a coherent picture. And if we look at flowering phenology, the timing of flowering of these meadow plants, we find that whether we look between control and heated plots, or along spatial gradients, or along interannual changes in snowmelt date. Everything is against snowmelt date here. That all of these responses show the same curve, the same basic pattern. So there's a universality to how phenology responds to manipulated warming, to warming along a spatial gradient going down a mountainside, or how warming responds to interannual or interdecadal changes in just because of climate variability. So for phenology, this is great. And everything we learned about phenology in the warming experiment, we can now extend to larger scales because of we identified the mechanism, causation, and here's the generalization over space and time. But with soil carbon, we can't do it, unfortunately. When we look at the control and heated plots, we see a difference in soil carbon that is related to mean annual temperature this way. And when we look along the gradient, we don't see that. We see a response along the gradient. Upper plots are cool, lower plots down the mountainside are warmer, and the climate response is almost at right angles to the manipulation response. So sometimes space for time works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, to just wrap this up, I want to say a little bit about what will happen to species on a larger scale. It's move or die, basically, in short time periods, adaptation in longer time periods. Current predictions rely on a combination of use of the so-called climate envelope concept and species area relationships to try to project how many species we'll lose as climate parameters on the Earth shift and the regions where species can find comfortable climate habitats shifts around on Earth's surface, generally uphill or poleward. Now, the idea is you look at the climate parameters associated with the current locations of plant species, you identify an envelope of climate parameters that explains where those species are today, and then you ask the climate models, where will those parameters look like that 50 years from now? That's where those plants could, if they could get there, be happy. And so you move the plants there on the assumption that dispersal is not limiting. And then you ask, are you packing too many species into too small a space? That's where the species area idea comes in, and then you end up making predictions. And our current predictions rely on both of those things. And unfortunately, they're making use of species area notions at large spatial scales that are manifestly untrue, and they're making use of climate envelope ideas that have many, many problems. Among them, there's the idea that the actual locations of plants Realized niches may differ from fundamental niches. Novel climate conditions may arise that don't correspond to any current combination of precipitation and temperature. And how do we know what's going to live in a novel climate condition that we don't see anywhere on Earth today? Other habitat requirements may not be met, even if the climate requirements are met further north. The soil might be wrong, for example, or there might not be a pollinator there to pollinate that plant species if it could get there. Failure to consider synergies with other environmental stresses. Mention the species area relationships at large scales are not well characterized. Very uncertain potential for dispersal. We don't know as much as we need to know about dispersal patterns. And I'm going to skip this, and I want to just mention briefly this idea of population structure. We tend to think about species as a unit, but species are made up often of genetically distinct subspecies or populations. And if we have a species, let's take a species that lies along either a poleward gradient or an elevational gradient. And here's the bottom of the range, the warmest point in the species range. Here's the coldest point. And let's suppose the population, for the moment, is not divided into the species is not divided into 5 populations, and we shift climate due to global warming by the amount shown here. That's an amount of temperature change, but in units of a range shift. So anything that had the temperature that was here now will become the temperature that's this much down below it in the future because of warming. This is warmer than that, so the temperature here today will look like the temperature that's here today, but tomorrow. Now, as you shift the climate, what you would do is you would lop off the bottom of this species distribution. Let's suppose the species can't disperse at all. These guys, which are cold now, will find it warmer. They'll be happy. These guys, which are at the warm end of the range, will be even warmer, and they'll let's say, die. So we'll lose this much of the species. If the species is divided into distinct populations, and you have this much range shift, each one of these locally adapted populations to the local climate will see this much range shift, and every one of these populations will die, the species will disappear. So whether or not a species is divided into locally adapted populations has a huge bearing on what species responses to climate change will look like. And unfortunately, we just don't know much about this. For very few species have been characterized with respect to their population level, local adaptation to local climate conditions. I'm going to skip through this because it's getting late. When we looked at the experiment in the Rockies and asked, do species matter, or can we lump everything into forbs and shrubs and grasses? Or better yet, could we just make a big green smear of all the life on Earth and call that plant? And the answer is that species level differences can matter hugely. We've discovered in the experiment that the response to climate is very much dependent on the depth of roots of plants. So we have shallow-rooted plants. We'll divide them somewhat arbitrarily into shallow-rooted and deep-rooted. Deep-rooted, less sensitive to drought. The effect on the carbon cycle of the plants depends a lot on the quality of the litter, the lignin to nitrogen ratio in the foliage of the plants. And plants differ in their lignin to nitrogen ratio. Low lignin to nitrogen means that organic matter turns over rapidly. Higher lignin to nitrogen means longer turnover times. So that can have a huge effect on the carbon cycle and the amount of carbon stored in the soil. So we took 4 species, and dominant species among the forbs in the control plots today, and they all differed by one or both of these traits. You had both shallow-rooted and deep-rooted. You had high lignin, low lignin, and it turns out that there are we have something like 45 species of forbs in these plots, and we can find significant ways in which each of them differs with respect to either their response to climate or their effect through feedback on climate. And so, to some extent, we certainly can't replace life on Earth with a green smear. I'm convinced that to really get reliable predictions of these feedback effects that are plant-mediated, we can't just divide things into forbs and shrubs and grasses. We have to look at functional groups of plants that allow us to separate out the traits that influence either response to climate or effect through feedback on climate. Okay, summary, main points. Paleo data, modern observations, and ecosystem manipulation experiments all suggest that ecosystems respond to climate change in ways that generate large feedbacks not currently included in our climate models. Many of the missing feedbacks appear to be positive. The warming will feed the warming through positive feedback, and as a result of that asymmetry in the feedback uncertainty diagram I showed you, these induce very asymmetric, or what are called fat-tailed uncertainties into climate model predictions. By combining manipulation experiments and interannual and spatial gradient observations, along with simple models, we can sometimes provide predictive insights. But many problems aren't answered this way yet and remain today, at least, unanswered. Nevertheless, in Earth system science, even though we know all these things, there are fundamental knowledge gaps that impede our ability to quantify vegetation responses, and therefore feedbacks, to climate change. And from what we've learned, the major impediments involve primarily gaps in our understanding of population structure within species and the potential for species to disperse to new climate regions under climate change. And I want to leave you with a final speculation, and that is that mitigating climate change could be a lot easier than understanding its consequences. Thanks. So, do you have questions?
Yes, before we do questions, I remember I forgot to thank Jessica, Mark, and Don for helping organize this whole thing today. So let's give them a round of applause. Good job. Yes.
The electromagnetic field of the Earth mitigates the effects of the solar wind, and it in turn is influenced by the movement of magma. I understand that there is currently a significant shift in the magma. We're getting a reversal again to our poles of magnetic poles. Is there any way to fit that element into the modeling?
Well, it's really, yeah. Did you all hear the question? No. The question had to do with evidence that looming on the horizon is a shift due to shifts in Earth's magma in the direction of the pole. The Earth's pole shifts north to south through paleohistory, and that a shift in the direction of the magnetic pole would alter the solar wind, which would have a big effect on climate. All of that is true. The question is, what's the distance to that horizon that this is on? And when I paraphrased your question, I deliberately said looming on the horizon a little bit sarcastically, because that horizon is not in the next 100 years. The problems we're dealing with here are all in the next 100, 200 years. Similarly, you could have said, look, there's an ice age a-coming, and there is. The Milankovitch mechanism is still operating, and we will certainly descend into a new ice age, but not in the next even 1,000 years. It will probably happen somewhere through 2, 3, 5, 6,000 years from now. And what I've always said is we should be leaving the coal in the ground today so that our great descendants 2,000 years from now can create a super greenhouse effect when they really need it during the next ice age, not now when we're in an interglacial and we sure as heck don't need it.
There was a French study of lizard ranges in the Alps.
Yeah.
And they looked at the, tail end of the ranges and found out that they tended to disappear, which would support your model similar to the fir trees. Have you looked at any other non-sessile organisms besides the plants you looked at?
Yeah, okay. The question is, well, he mentioned that lizards are undergoing some serious responses, probably due to climate change in the Alps, with warmer end of the range lizards showing serious problems. And then you were asking, besides plants, what other organisms have been looked at that don't have the capacity to?
No, actually, that you looked at.
Oh, that do have the capacity to move.
No, that you looked at in your study.
In our study, we did only three research projects on non-plants. We looked at microorganisms in the soil, bacteria and fungi. We looked at soil mesofauna, and then we looked at various herbivores and pathogens on the plants themselves. And we found a systematic pattern with soil mesofauna responding adversely to soil drying. We see an effect on soil microbes, bacteria and fungi, that's very dramatic, and huge drop in microbial activity in heated plots. And then we don't see a systematic response of herbivores to the heating.
Question to that. Yeah, I have a question. It's not that we're not doing anything to decrease the global warming. We're making a lot of improvements in technology.
Could you speak louder?
We're trying to improve, decrease the global warming, and our technology is improving, right? So is ice age, can we eliminate global warming if we make improvements, or is ice age we can't avoid and it's inevitable?
I'm not sure I understand. You're asking about the next ice age,
yeah,
and whether it will help us deal with global warming. Is that right?
I'm asking if we decrease our carbon footprint, will that impact the inevitability?
Oh, okay. No. I shouldn't say no. I should say that the answer to that question is way beyond our capacity to project. Because what you're really asking is, if we don't decrease our carbon output and we continue to warm the planet, will we get the planet into a configuration where the next ice age might not occur? For example, if we heat the Earth and we get positive feedbacks amplifying, creating a runaway effect, and we heat the ocean to the point where the ocean releases a significant portion of its dissolved carbon dioxide, we could get a super greenhouse and start looking like Venus. I don't think that's very likely. If you model that runaway effect, you find that it's very unlikely to occur on Earth. But we can't say for sure that won't happen. If it happened, we would probably not see the next ice age, but we would also not even be around to see it, because with that kind of runaway greenhouse effect, we'd be dead. Humanity would not survive that. So there are too many what-ifs in the scenarios to give you a definitive answer. But it's certainly not an argument to avoid dealing with global warming. The idea that somehow if we reduce carbon emissions, we'll end up in an ice age just doesn't make sense, because that's not something that's going to happen in the next 1,000 or 2,000 years. And we shouldn't be worried about that. We should be worried about the next 100 to 200 years. Steve.
John, I guess my question is, what is the scaling of these experiments? That is, you might see lots of individual species differences in response to warming, but what if you average the effects over, thousands of square kilometers? What sorts of insights would these experiments have?
Steve has asked, what if you have data on, or could get data for experiments like this over many, many types of habitat all over the earth? What would the average of those experiments look like? Well, unfortunately, we don't have very many experiments, so we don't know for sure. But the experiments we do have, a warming experiment in a bog in Minnesota, the warming experiment at the Harvard Forest in Massachusetts, warming work in northern Sweden, warming work at Toolik Lake in Alaska. All of these show similar patterns. The details might differ, but the general pattern is the same. That shift from forbs to shrubs, the loss of soil carbon, those are pretty much universal, but only among a dozen or so studies maximum. There have been meta-analyses of all the warming experiments on Earth, and they tend to give convergent picture of the future with positive feedbacks dominant over negative, and clear hint that were we somehow to get enough of that knowledge together and put biology into the climate models, we would see more dire outcomes than are currently projected.
Chris had a question.
Yeah, I really appreciate your drawing attention to the positive feedbacks idea and the importance of biotic interactions in affecting climate change. I'm not sure that the example of spruce trees driving the glacial retreat is the best one to use, just because the boreal forest is a very important carbon sink, and that might balance out the albedo effects. But I think it does raise a really important point that we need to refocus funding and energy and attention to plant research to try and understand the importance of plants in both how climate change is affecting them and also how they're potentially driving climate change as well.
Yeah, there's a question in there where you made a statement, and it's a very correct and useful statement, but we can also ask, on the basis of what you said, how will shifts, say, in the boreal forest affect climate? Now, it's interesting, because the boreal forest is projected to move north of its current northern limit, if you believe the climate envelope models. So an expansion of boreal forest into what's currently tundra is going to darken the polar region, lower its albedo, causing huge positive feedback. The summer albedo feedback effect in the Arctic from that is gigantic. Equivalent to probably a couple degrees minimum of warming locally, maybe 3 even. The southern end of the range of boreal forest may or may not also shift northward, causing the death of trees. Probably what will happen is they'll be infested by bark beetles, die and burn, and so we'll probably get both a positive carbon feedback and a positive albedo feedback. I think we're going to see the worst of both worlds there, both the southern and northern end of the range limit. And Lovelock had this lovely book called The Gaia Hypothesis that made it sound like everything was going to be hunky-dory, that the biology works to dampen catastrophes. And he invented this model called Daisy World, in which he rigged it so that the dark daisies did better when it was cold, but they create warmth, and the light-colored daisies did better when it was warm, but they create cool because they're light-colored. Now, the world is not like Daisy World. It's like what I call sagebrush world, or boreal forest world, where the feedbacks all work against us. Now, he rigged a model, a purely theoretical model, and it was nice because it had the Gaia mechanism built in. But that was a model. The data suggest boreal world or sagebrush world is a lot more realistic than daisy world.
There's a question in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so these warming experiments just look at warming as the single variable and then look at plant response. Do we understand enough about climate change impacts on weather to extrapolate like that?
Yeah. Great question. We look at climate, temperature. What about weather? First of all, I just want to clarify one thing. Temperature is actually not the most useful explanatory variable. In our work, the date of snowmelt in that subalpine habitat is much more explanatory than global average temperature or May temperature or July temperature. Date of snowmelt has enormous explanatory power in these alpine systems. Now, that said, the weather will change under climate change. We can think of weather as sort of the local place-to-place, day-to-day variability in climate, and climate is the average of weather. Now, we don't know a lot about how day-to-day variability will change in a warmer climate. It's one of those things that climate models can predict, but which we have relatively lower confidence in than we do in the climate predictions. So I'm a little reluctant to try to, tell you what it is that the climate model weather predictions would inform us about, because I'm not sure I believe them.
Let's thank John now, and please join us outside for some more reception. We'll see you other room. There's Sierra room for